Today's readings are both from Luke. The first is Luke 20, verses 17 and 18. But Jesus looked around at them and said, "What then does it mean in the Bible when it says, 'The very stone the builders refused, now for the corner's top is used'? Everyone who falls on that stone will be smashed to smithereens, but if it falls on anyone, it will crush them." And Luke 21, verses 5 through 19. Some people were talking about the temple, saying how wonderfully it was decorated, with its beautiful stones and dedicated gifts. "Yes," said Jesus, "but the days will come when everything you see will be torn down. Not one stone will be left standing on another." "Teacher," they asked him, "when will these things happen? What will be the sign that it's all about to take place?" "Watch out that nobody deceives you," said Jesus. "Yes, lots of people will come using my name, saying, 'I'm the one,' and 'the time has come.' Don't go following them. When you hear about wars and rebellions, don't be alarmed. These things have to happen first, but the end won't come at once. One nation will rise against another," he went on, "and one kingdom against another. There will be huge earthquakes, famines, and plagues in various places, terrifying omens, and great signs from heaven. Before all this happens, they will lay hands on you and persecute you. They will hand you over to the synagogues and prisons. They will drag you before kings and governors because of my name. That will become an opportunity for you to tell your story. So settle it in your hearts not to work out beforehand what tale to tell. I'll give you a mouth and wisdom, which none of your opponents will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends, and they will kill some of you. You'll be hated by everyone because of my name. But no hair of your head will be lost. The way to keep your lives is to be patient."
Thank you for those two readings from Luke. I've called my message today, "Everybody Must Get Stoned." It's been one of those weeks, huh?
Wow.
That in 1966, the opening track from Bob Dylan's album Blonde on Blonde was a song with the kind of cryptic title, "Rainy Day Women, number 12 and 35. But it became popularly known as "Everybody Must Get Stoned." Here's a short version of Dylan performing this song, but just this year in 2016. And this is somebody in the audience videoing it, but it didn't come out too bad. So this is just a short, he's like it's part of a medley that he's doing. Here's a short version of it. So by a show of hands, how many people have been to a church service where this was the sermon title? Not too many? No, I bet you haven't. Well, this is a song that most people think is talking about taking drugs or getting high, getting stoned. And you can see one of the audience members at the chorus, everybody must get stoned, held his beer can up. And so maybe it's because it's so difficult to understand Dylan when he sings. That you're not really sure of that song. You're not quite sure of all the lyrics except for that one phrase. And that one he seems to sing pretty clearly and plainly, and everybody seems to catch on to that one. That's the hook line. Everybody must get stoned. It was written, of course, in the mid-'60s, right in the middle of the drug culture, the sexual revolution and all of that. So I think that lent that idea to the song. But in classic Dylan style, his songs are not always that easy to understand what he's talking about. And I actually think that it's not a song about getting high. I actually think it's one of the most misunderstood songs in all of pop music history. And so we'll get to some of the actual lyrics later in the message. But let's first look at Luke 20, the first of the two texts today. It's the parable of the landowner who has a vineyard, and he leases his vineyard to some tenants. And after a time, the landowner sends a servant to receive his share of the produce from the vineyard. But the tenants beat the servant and send him away empty-handed. After that, the landowner sends two more servants. They either beat or stone these servants as well and send them away empty-handed. And finally, the landowner sends his son, thinking, perhaps they will respect my son. But the tenants not only throw him out of the vineyard, they kill the son, the landowner's son. Then Jesus says this. He looked at them and said, what then does this text mean? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls. That text that Jesus quotes there is actually not original with him. It comes from Psalm 118. And Jesus in here likens himself to a stone that builders reject. But this rejected stone then becomes a cornerstone. Because cornerstones are the stones that hold entire buildings together. They're the most important stone in the building. Jesus was telling this parable to scribes and chief priests. Today, we'd say he's telling it to church leaders. He's telling it to the leaders of our congregations. He was essentially saying, you scribes and chief priests, or you church leaders, have had the wrong cornerstone all along. Or you're referencing your building to the wrong thing. Because the cornerstone is the stone that all the other stones are referenced in relation to. I'm the cornerstone, he says, that the kingdom of God must be oriented to, but you guys have rejected me. In other words, you have your orientation all messed up. You have a different cornerstone, or you've oriented yourself to the wrong thing. Then in verse 18, he says, everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls. Peter makes reference to this stone as a stone of stumbling or a rock of offense in 1 Peter 2. It's a stone that everybody encounters. Some will fall over it and be broken. Others will resist it, and it will fall on them. Everybody must get stoned. But Peter, in quoting Isaiah 28:16, also says this, see, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So everyone encounters this stone that God sent into the world. We all are going to have this encounter with him. And notice that Isaiah knew that this coming cornerstone would be a person. You see how he switches there. I'm laying in Zion a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him. So even the prophet Isaiah foresaw a time when they were going to have to reorient things, a time when there would be a person that they would reorient their whole faith around. Those who fall on this stone will be broken, but will also experience the precious beauty of this cornerstone. But those who resist this breaking will be put to shame, in the words of Isaiah. The stone is the same. It is a beautiful, precious stone given by God, the landowner, we could say, out of love. Some will allow themselves to be broken by this stone. Others will resist and be crushed. The scribes and the chief priests would resist and find themselves crushed within one generation. The second text today from Luke 21 is Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, where he describes the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. He's not talking about end times destruction that the typical left behind theology espouses. He's talking about a first century happening that's going to be coming into their sights really soon. Everybody must get stoned. Then in Luke 21 is this prophecy of the temple's destruction. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." All these allusions to the stones, all these allusions in these stories to Jesus, really, to Jesus, and the incorrect referencing of the temple system to a different kind of cornerstone. The stones that made up the temple were about to come undone in less than 40 years. The stones that had been laid in reference to a different cornerstone, basically is what Jesus is saying, would not remain in place for even one more generation. So this referencing stone that all of Judaism and really the world had oriented itself to, in less than one generation after the cornerstone that was sent from Zion, to Zion, came, would come undone. That's how powerful the incarnation of Jesus is. That the way all religion organized itself prior to the incarnation of Jesus would be revealed for what it was. The scribes and the chief priests had oriented the temple around a particular kind of cornerstone, and after the incarnation of Jesus, that cornerstone would no longer hold. Cornerstones interlock with and hold the whole structure together. So what was the cornerstone that held the temple together? And I'm not talking about the physical cornerstone that held it together, but what was this cornerstone that Jesus came to reveal to us? It was sacrifice. The temple was built upon blood sacrifice. The idea that God required the sacrifices of bulls, goats, lambs, even people, in order to set people in right standing with God. That was the cornerstone that the temple was oriented to. That was the cornerstone that all religion was oriented to. The cornerstone of the temple was, in other words, thinking sacrificially about God. Sacrifices often were buried under the cornerstone. When a temple or a new municipal building was built, often there would be a sacrifice offered, and the body of that sacrifice would be buried under the cornerstone. Sacrifices were the rituals that the Jews and other people had learned to practice to keep peace in their societies. See, how do they function that way? Well, Girard argues that cultures that had learned to bring peace through the scapegoat mechanism, and then they enacted ritual sacrifice, in other words, over and over again, whether it's weekly or yearly, they would enact this practice of ritual sacrifice to commemorate the original sacrifice, the original scapegoat that brought the community together, and also to reinstitute that peace, that catharsis that came at the founding murder that congealed the society. So when Isaiah prophesies of a precious cornerstone being laid in Zion, he wasn't speaking of a physical cornerstone for a building. He wasn't prophesying a new sacrificial temple, in other words. He was prophesying something completely unsacrificial or anti-sacrificial, you could say. The sacrificial thinking, though, all to this time, didn't just remain in the temple. I mean, if you have a religious system oriented around sacrifice, your thinking won't remain anti-sacrificial except for when you're in the temple or when you're practicing your religion. It'll spill out into everything else in your life. That's why stoning became a primary means of capital punishment. It even is today in some places. The sacrifice for a human life for a violation of a taboo or a legal code. The sacrificial cornerstone of the temple found its way into the thinking of people. And Jesus intervened to save people from this sacrificial impulse. And it is a strong impulse. I've spent much of my life giving in to that sacrificial impulse. And of late, in more recent years, now that I understand it more and understand where it's coming from, I'm able to resist that sacrificial impulse a little bit more. And it didn't just happen in the past. This is an actual photograph of a woman who was about to be stoned in the Middle East for adultery. They bury women up to their waist or even up to their chest so they can't move, and then the crowd surrounds them and stones them to death. This woman was accused of adultery and lost her life in this stoning. Other women in the Middle East have been stoned for posting messages critical of ISIS on Facebook. I think this is what Jesus is getting at when he repeatedly says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. See, mercy is a very different cornerstone than is sacrifice. We don't like that one because we feel like people aren't getting what's due them. But guess what? We didn't get what's due us either. And it's out of that forgiveness that God has granted to us that we can become merciful and forgiving toward others. So a faulty cornerstone in our understanding of God leads to all kinds of unmerciful behavior in our lives in the name of God. If you have a view of God being a sacrificial creature, then we copy that, we imitate that, we become like that God. But Isaiah's prophecy was of a different kind of stone and a different kind of stoning. He was prophesying a human stone, and everybody must get stoned by this human stone. Bob Dylan's lyrics echo the kind of stoning that humans do to one another out of spite and hatred and fear. The kind of stonings that bring a satanic kind of peace, like a unity against a common enemy. So let's look at some of the lyrics of this song. Remember, this was written in the middle of the 60s when racial tensions were very high, when Dylan actually sang at some Martin Luther King rallies. So he was very involved with the civil rights movement at this time. So keep that in mind as we read some of these lyrics. They'll stone you when you're trying to be so good. They'll stone you just like they said they would. They'll stone you when you're trying to go home. They'll stone you when you're there all alone. But I would not feel so alone. Everybody must get stoned. So imagine that he's writing these lyrics about the people that have been marginalized for years, and that he's trying to draw attention to these people. As you read that verse, it dawned on me immediately, oh, he's not talking about getting high. He's talking about people being taken advantage of, abused, stoned, in other words, by the broader society that they live in. What's the next verse? They'll stone you when you're at the breakfast table. They'll stone you when you are young and able. They'll stone you when you're trying to make a buck. They'll stone you, and then they'll say, good luck. But I would not feel so alone. Everybody must get stoned. He touches on just the everyday living there, about trying to earn a living and not being treated fairly, not being treated like other people, and finding yourself under the heel of taskmasters, really. Let's look at one more. They'll stone you when you are all alone. They'll stone you when you are walking home. They'll stone you and then say they're all brave. They're all brave. They'll stone you when you're sent down in your grave. But I would not feel so alone. Everybody must get stoned. So these are 1960s protest lyrics that protest the unjust treatment of minorities, especially racial minorities at this time. Lyrics that gave voice to victims of cultural violence. Lyrics that gave voice to the despair of being those victims. These are the kind of lyrics that a prophet who sees the suffering of people who are being treated that way by the wicked tenants brings out into the culture. These are prophetic lyrics, really. Our nation has many people who feel this way. On both today, we have many people that feel this way too, on both sides of our political spectrum, or all across the political spectrum. Many people have felt the effects of a changing economy over the last 20 or 30 years. We've had a significant change in our economy. There are lots of factories like this that have been shuttered. They've lost the kind of jobs that they saw their parents had for a lifetime. And so many of these people are struggling to make ends meet, and they're working harder and harder, but they're unable to make any progress, any economic progress. There are lots of complex reasons for this, and there are reasons that don't lend themselves to simplistic explanations and simplistic promises of restoration. These are complex issues. But these people that have suffered this way feel like they've been stoned by the wicked tenants. They feel like they just want their share of the vineyard, but they've been resisted at receiving that. I can understand that. On the other hand, we have many people that belong to diverse racial and ethnic and religious or cultural or sexual minorities. And these people have felt the stonings of wicked tenants too. They've seen some relief in the past generation or so, but they're afraid that this election will marginalize them again. These folks just want their share of the vineyard too. Elections have a way of bringing out the worst in people. And we've been witnessing that all through this last year and a half. We could say elections have a way of making wicked tenants out of all of us. We all like to cast our judgments on the other side, on the people that are, whether we're the ones that have been hurt economically, maybe lost our jobs and haven't been able to find the same kind of employment our parents had. They like to lob bombs at the people that they perceive are the reason for that. People in this group where they've been marginalized for a long time, they have their own ideas about that, and there's lots of hand-wringing and mudslinging in both directions. Wanting to keep a tight grip on what we have to the extent that we'll even stone and kill those who want their share of the vineyard. The tendency then is for each group to see the other as the wicked tenants. We have more than two, but I'm just, as an example, we have these two broad groups that I'm talking about today. They tend to each see the other group as the wicked tenants. Tenants, and that are refusing them access to what they feel is their fair share. And they begin stoning each other. But this is to misunderstand the problem. Charles Einstein, an interesting character, wrote this past week. At such moments, or moments like this, it is a normal response to find someone to blame, as if identifying fault could restore the lost normality, and to lash out in anger. Hate and blame are convenient ways of making meaning out of a bewildering situation. Anyone who disputes the blame narrative may receive more hostility than the opponents themselves, as in wartime when pacifists are more reviled than the enemy. So what I'm going to try to do today is play that last sentence. Anyone who disputes the blame narrative. I'm going to be the guy today that disputes the blame narrative, that says we're not going to solve our problems as a nation or as Christians or as individuals by blaming other people. But he says, and I think it's a correct observation, anyone who disputes the blame narrative may receive more hostility than the opponents themselves. So the person that says, no, the problem is not that group, or the problem is not that group, is likely to get the wrath of both groups poured out on them. Blame is another word for accusation, and accusation, as we've seen, is the voice of Satan, the accuser. Casting blame and accusation, then, should not be the vocabulary of Jesus followers, because if we do, we're speaking for Satan, not for Jesus, when we start to cast blame and accusation. Paul gave us some direction for times like this in Romans 12. He wrote this: rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. That's such an important verse, verse 15 in Romans 12. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. We have some people rejoicing this week. We have some people weeping this week. Paul says, meet both of those groups. Don't pick sides in that fight. Rejoice with those that rejoice and weep with those that weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. So I don't claim to have answers to the complex societal problems we face. I don't claim to know exactly how to solve the intractable problems that divide our nation, but I know that stoning each other is not the solution. When Jesus entered Jerusalem on a donkey and he wept because the people didn't know what made for peace, he gave us a way to peace. Peace is the way. Like we often think, oh, how do you get to peace? Well, peace is not the end goal. Peace is the way there. We have to become peaceful people on the way to peace. That's the only way peace arrives. But we don't like the peaceful way, so we resort to stoning and blaming and accusing each other. But when we fall on the stone who is Jesus, our blaming and accusatory ways are broken off of us. That's what I think that means when we fall, when we trip up over Jesus, and we all do. He is a stumbling block for everybody. How many know following Jesus is not the natural way to live? It just doesn't come easy. You know, we trip over it. There's things that happen that really trip us up. But the alternative is that we'll be crushed under the weight of the stones of fear and accusation hurled at us. I think Jesus knew what he was talking about when he said the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but it will crush anyone on whom it falls. And I think Isaiah was onto something when he wrote, "See, I am laying in Zion a cornerstone, a chosen and precious stone, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." Or in the words of a modern-day prophet, one way or another, everybody must get stoned. In Luke 4, when Jesus went into the temple that first time after his temptation, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Jesus is giving us his orientation in those few verses. He's oriented toward the poor, the captives, the blind, and the oppressed. I think his body, the church, must have that same orientation. If we are his hands and feet in the world, and he clearly gave us his job description, this is what he says he came for, to be oriented toward the poor, the captives, the blind, and the oppressed. That ought to be our orientation as the church too. And we can find people like that, the blind, the captives, the poor, and the oppressed, on both sides of the political spectrum. They don't reside just on one side or the other. They're all across the spectrum, right? And we must not use the vocabulary of Satan to address them. The body of Christ is called first and foremost to speak for those on the margins. We have other voices and other things that we can bring to the surface, but if we're following the example of Jesus and the orientation of Jesus, our first and foremost call is to speak with and to stand with those that are marginalized. I linked a blog last night on my Facebook page by Jonathan Martin. I'd encourage you to read it, but it's long. But I'll just read a little bit of it toward the end. Jonathan's a pastor and just a very interesting guy who is a teaching pastor at Sanctuary Church in Tulsa right now. This is just a little bit toward the end of his blog. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Don't speak from the center. The center already has more than enough people speaking for it. The center does not need your protection. Speak for and with the one who was crucified outside the gate. Speak from the margins. If you will not speak from the margins, don't you dare claim to speak for God. We need you. I need you. The world needs your prophetic voice. Don't pontificate, damn it. Prophesy. prophesy. Prophesy.